psalmist declares, "Walk about Zion and go all around her. Count her towers, mark well her bulwarks, consider her palaces." On this Roots and Reflections, we're going to take up that exhortation, walking all around Mount Zion. But is this really the Zion of David?
The name Zion moved. The mountain didn't move. In the Bible, we read a verse, Psalm 48, that talks about Mount Zion on the sides of the north. Well, if you look at the map today, Mount Zion is on the side of the west and south, outside the city. And you say, what happened? The mountain moved to the west and to the south over time. And that's what we have as Mount Zion today.
The Mount Zion typifies, the place and the area where God is going to pour out His Spirit and fill, again, the sons of Greece, those who believe His word, and touch, again, the entire nation, as well as the world, the nations of the world.
This model of Jerusalem in the First Temple period, the time of the kings of Judah, shows how the original city of David, including the Temple Mount, expanded westward, eventually absorbing Mount Zion into Jerusalem. 3 millennia later, in 1948, the reborn state of Israel was fighting for its survival, with battles raging in the very city chosen by King David as capital. After a long siege, the Jewish quarter fell to the Jordanian Arab Legion. Jews were again forced to flee synagogues and homes where they had lived for centuries. However, in a counterattack on May 18, 1948, the Harel Brigade of the Palmach at least succeeded in taking Mount Zion, which for the next 2 decades served as Israel's front line next to the Old City. This position was precariously separated from West Jerusalem by the steep valley of Gehenna.
Look at this. This is a hand-cranked, tough-to-move invention of Uriel Chefetz, who was an Israeli soldier in the Engineering Corps during the War of Independence in 1948. In fact, this cable car went the length of 200 meters to Mount Zion, rising 50 meters above the Ben Hinnom Valley, and was lowered during the day so the Arab Legion armies couldn't see it, but by night it was fully put in use to evacuate the wounded soldiers and people, as well as sending food supplies, medical supplies, and of course ammunition to fight for Israel's survival. This was one incredible invention by one incredible man, and it was only revealed to the public in 1972. Up to Mount Zion.
The Cable Car Museum is well worth a visit on the way to Mount Zion. The actual gondola car remains suspended above the valley floor as a memorial of aspirations to return to the Jewish quarter. Since the cable car is no longer running, the way across is on foot, with a detour down the valley.
Coming out of the sewers of the Gehenna Valley, this was a pretty stinky place considering a lot of bad things went on here. 3,000 years ago, this was the garbage dump of Jerusalem. This valley is associated with fire. It is synonymous with the word hell, or Gehinnom in Hebrew. This valley is associated with abomination and child sacrifice. As parents offered their innocent children and babies to the ancient fire rituals, worshiping the pagan idol Moloch, they eased their seared consciences, thinking they were doing a good deed.
The abominable high place in the valley of Gehenna was called Tophet, which suggests in Hebrew a place of drums, which were beaten to drown out the screams of infants burned to Moloch. The smoke of blazing pyres rose above Gehenna. Thankfully, the righteous King Josiah ended the practice of baby sacrifice, and he defiled Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man might make his son or his daughter pass through the fire to Moloch. Jeremiah later prophesied that the place would be used as a cemetery.
The secret passage to Akeldama, 4 fingers in the holes of the rock. This is Akeldama, the field of blood. After Judas betrayed Jesus, he said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." Then he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went out and hanged himself. The chief priest decided to take those 30 pieces of silver and buy a burial place, a potter's field to bury strangers in, here in the field of blood in the valley of Gehenna.
And talking about a place to bury strangers, next to Akeldama is a little visited Crusader vault, used as the last resting place for prominent members of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. Nearby, the valley walls are honeycombed by Second Temple period tombs. Jeremiah was right. Time to get back to Mount Zion. I mentioned that it stood on the front line for 19 years as the forward Israeli position next to the Old City. Jews crossing the valley to get as near as possible to the holy sites faced sniper fire along the pilgrimage route up to Zion.
From 1948 to 1967, Jewish worshippers came up to Zion along this path, which is now abandoned. In those days, it actually sheltered them from sniper fire, but brought them one step closer to the Western Wall and the Temple Mount. At this spot for 19 years was the closest position that Jewish worshippers could get to the Western Wall in Jerusalem.
Do you want to know more about Roots and Reflections? Or find out about our upcoming tours or the humanitarian work of Vision for Israel? Maybe you want to buy one of Barry and Batia's worship CDs or download a free copy of Batia's recipes seen in the series. Well, the best place for all this is our website, roots4u.tv. Here you can also sign up for our free Jerusalem on the Line newsletter. Online is also a great way to donate to this ministry, so go to roots4u.tv and start exploring today.
The area of Mount Zion has changed a lot in 2,000 years, yet one practice carried on today as then is visiting the tomb of King David. Accessible through the courtyard of a yeshiva and synagogue, it is marked by a dark tombstone covered in velvet cloth. 20 centuries ago, it was different. The tomb was housed under a monumental structure capped by a solid stone pyramid, as seen in this Holy Land model of ancient Jerusalem, which follows the description of the ancient Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. David's tomb was probably comparable in size and shape to the Second Temple period tombs in the Kidron Valley, known as the Tomb of Zechariah and the Monument of Absalom.
Obviously, this structure in its current form didn't exist here 3,000 years ago. But 2,000 years ago, we read in the writings of Josephus that there was a tomb, the tomb of King David, in the area of Mount Zion. Pilgrims from all over came to venerate and show their respect and come visit the tomb of King David.
Mount Zion is layered, not as in archaeological mounds, but rather architecturally. Visitors walk up flights of stairs from David's tomb to Christian and Muslim places of interest on higher floors, and roofs with spectacular views. Under Islamic rule, religious sites revered by Christians or Jews were only allowed to exist in the shadow of the dominant minaret.
This minaret, built during the Islamic period, overlooking the courtyard where the tomb of King David lies, reminds me of a story how Muhammad himself appointed blind men as muezzins in order to call forth prayer for the Muslims. But it brings us back to another story. Why did he do this? Because, of course, perched high in the minarets, they could look down upon the courtyard, look at immodest women. Kind of reminds us of the story of David and Bathsheba. So I think we just better close our eyes and move on. On the rooftop above King David's tomb, behind me is the King David Hotel. I wonder if King David ever thought a hotel in Jerusalem would be named after him. Which brings up a good question. Who's collecting royalties on his name today? I'm a son of David. Let's go check it out.
Below the minaret is the traditional site of the upper room, where the disciples were instructed to prepare the Last Supper. As with David's tomb directly underneath, the upper room did not look like this 2,000 years ago. The hall is actually a part of a Crusader church and received its present form from the Franciscans, who purchased it in 1335. Later, it was turned into a mosque. No one knows the exact location of the original upper room, but it could have been somewhere on Mount Zion. The important thing is that these traditional sites offer a focal point for devotion.
Here, Jesus and his disciples celebrated the Passover the Last Supper. Now on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Yeshua, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man, and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples." So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. This, in fact, is where the Messianic movement began 2,000 years ago, as we read the account in the book of Acts. When the day of Pentecost, or Shavuot, had fully come, they were all with one accord in one place. And suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. But this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. "And it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams."
There's a rabbinic tradition that talks about the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. Of course, the Feast of Shavuot, or Pentecost, is traditionally exactly the time when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. That at the time of the giving of the Torah, the Word of God appeared as tongues of fire, coming down off of Mount Sinai and spreading out over the people. 70, it says, because 70 was the traditional number of the nations of the world, the 70 Gentile nations, and that the people could actually hear the words and see them at the same time with the fire. So this itself is already a very interesting parallel for the day of Pentecost. It's clear from the context that the crowd mentioned there is a crowd of people coming for the festival, pilgrims who have expanded the city greatly to come in for the Feast of Shavuot, and that they were there to do mitzvot, commandments. One of the mitzvot was to take your tithe, your second tithe, and spend it for anything you wanted, as long as you spent it in the holy city. So that was holy tourism, and we still have it with us until today.
Obviously, the first century congregation comprised with Jewish people, local believers who believed the Bible and the prophets.
We believe in the Bible and the prophets, so let's take a devotional break with Batya and a worship song.
Do you enjoy the music featured in the Roots and Reflections programs? We are delighted to tell you that all of Barry and Batya's music is available on CD or DVD. From the pioneering work of Shema Yisrael, produced by Martin Smith of Delirious, to the much acclaimed album Go Through the Gates. The music is a unique fusion of Israeli and Western praise and worship. All our albums are available to buy, either by calling the number on the screen or by going online to roots4u.tv. Some of the tracks are also available to download as MP3s from the website. So act now and make sure you don't miss out on one of these fabulous albums.
Where have all the Messianics been hiding since the early centuries of the Christian church? In fact, an inscription was discovered on Mount Zion with the name inscribed Yeshua, Yud, Shin, Vav, Ayin, which evidence points towards the presence of a strong Messianic community here on Mount Zion. Well, it's time to come out of hiding and discover our roots.
Reflecting on those roots, ceramic tiles are available at some Jerusalem shops depicting the early Hebrew Messianic inscription, Yeshua.
The size of the community, we have very little evidence. Everybody knows the evidence from the New Testament, 3,000, 5,000, and then myriads mentioned in chapter 21 of Acts, which would be tens of thousands. But in all three of those occasions, we were talking about a pilgrimage feast, and the numbers could have been swelled by people from outside the country. We have an indication that there was a vibrant community of Jewish believers in the city for the next generation. And then when the war came against Rome in 66, somewhere between 66 and 70, part at least of that community fled the city, went east over the Jordan River, about the same time that the Pharisee community was fleeing and going west down to the coast.
2,000 years ago, the entire slope of Mount Zion all the way down to the Pool of Siloam and the city of David was encompassed by the walls of Jerusalem. Wealthier citizens lived in the upper neighborhood of Mount Zion. Humbler dwellings crowded the lower slopes with stairs serving as street access from the bottom of the Tyropoeon Valley. It was up this slope that Yeshua was led after his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane to the house of Caiaphas, which stood in the wealthier neighborhood. And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and elders were assembled.
After the arrest of Jesus in Gethsemane, the most direct route to the house of Caiaphas the high priest would have been up these steps where Jesus was taken. They date back to the Second Temple period, and in those days were within inside the walls of the city of Jerusalem.
At the top of the stairs on Mount Zion is the Church of St. Peter and Gallicantu, named after the episode of Peter's triple denial of Jesus. Gallicantu is Latin for rooster crow. The present church was built in 1931 by the Catholic Assumptionist Fathers atop earlier Byzantine and Crusader churches, which in turn were constructed over the wealthy Second Temple residential quarter.
The rooster that crowed here 3 times got a permanent memorial. What a heart-rending story when we consider Peter and his frailty, as well as some of the disciples. For it is here in this courtyard that we remember the scripture in Luke. Having arrested Jesus, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled the fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat amongst them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, Yeshua the Messiah, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." As the story goes on, Peter denies Jesus 3 times and the rooster crows. Under the church, where the house of Caiaphas the high priest stood, is an underground complex, and in this complex is a pit. Now, in the Gospels, it refers to Jesus having been held before he was taken before Pilate. He was held at the house of Caiaphas the high priest. Possibly this pit or dungeon is the place. If Jesus was kept in this dungeon room, he would have been lowered by ropes through the hole in the ceiling to this dungeon pit.
This may have been the house of Caiaphas. We're not sure about that, but it's a good possibility. And that then Jesus was held in a pit in the ground, and he would have been lifted up by ropes, much like Jeremiah had happened to him when he was lowered into a pit in the mud. We're not given any indication that Jesus was in the mud or anything, but it could have been, if it was some kind of cistern at that time of the year. It was right after the winter rains. It could also have had water in it. We don't know.
This line shows us the present-day walls of the old city of Jerusalem, but 2,000 years ago, the walls were much greater, which were inclusive of Mount Zion. It is here that the house of Caiaphas stood. During the Byzantine period, between the 4th and 6th centuries, the Temple Mount was left desolate, as we see here in this model of Jerusalem dating back to that time. Nevertheless, the Byzantine authorities did allow Jews to come up and mourn the loss of their temple once a year on the 9th of Av. Throughout the rest of the city of Jerusalem at that time, it was prospering under Christianity, and churches sprang up all over. The Nia Church, which in Latin is the New Church, St. Peter of Gallicantu, the church down at the Pool of Siloam, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Churches sprang up all over as the population grew because of the influx of pilgrims from all over the world.
Have you ever wanted to come and experience firsthand the land of Israel, to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, or gain a greater understanding of the Bible? We run regular Roots and Reflections tours to Israel and would be delighted to host you and your family for the opportunity of a lifetime as you come and experience the land of the Bible with us. To receive more information on our tours, register your interest today. Either call the number on the screen, email us at barry@rootsforyou.tv, or go to our website. We look forward to seeing you in Israel.
This area of Mount Zion should have been included inside the rebuilt walls of the city of Jerusalem under the leadership of Suleiman the Magnificent, the head of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, who was resident in Turkey. Of course, he went ahead and he hired a couple architects who decided to cut the budget, leaving this part outside the city walls, and they pocketed the money, and as a result, when Suleiman found out, he had them strung up like Judas, and boy, did they become turkeys.
On this edition of Roots and Reflections, we have not been getting enough food. I'm hungry, so let's get a snack from a nutty sweet vendor on Mount Zion.
And which one would you like? So, I'll take one with the walnuts. Nice big size. What do you want?
I'll take the pistachio.
And he'll have pistachio? Okay. This is a nutty business, but this is freshly made walnuts into a kind of candy bar, and pistachios. 1 for me and 2 for me. There you go. Thank you. Wow. Walnuts on Mount Zion. This is a nutty business. Mount Zion is home to many yeshivas, and that brings us to the word of the week, yeshiva. What is the meaning of yeshiva?
Sit, לשבת, sit down and learn. That's it. לשבת, sit down and learn.
Yeshiva has been always a term that accompanied the Jewish people. It wasn't life. Was no life without sitting after food, before food, in the evening, sitting around the Word of God and discussing the plan of the purposes of God for His people.
Yeshiva is a place where they sit in God's presence and learn His laws.
So yeshiva is a learning place that's really a
school.
A school for learning for all nations.
All nations. But exactly, all nations, whoever wants to learn about God, he has to sit. Because there's no way how to know it without sitting. If you sit and you learn, then you know it. Being in a yeshiva is not only learning the text, it's also the main thing is seeing a live example from the rabbis, how to act and how to treat one another in all ways. Let's say in the kitchen, you eat, so you got to put the plate back. So it's a life thing of learning. It's not only this in the text. The Talmud way how to put things out is through a question and an answer. So it sharpens the text when it's through a question and an answer. But if you just read a text that feeds it to you in a spoon, you're not using your brain. So that's why it's made in this way that you understand different things. But in the Torah, there's also a lot of parts. That's why you need the rabbis that to the certain things that you can see in the text yourself that you don't need the rabbi for. But you need the rabbi to give you the tradition that are over the text more than what it says inside. But especially the Diaspora Yeshiva is special by opening the doors to everyone. That's the specialty that we have here to all the diaspora, especially at Mount Zion and King David. But David's Psalms was for everyone. So the yeshiva has to be for everyone and everyone that wants to come and know about Judaism.
Rabbi Goldstein gives us an exclusive tour of a section not open to the public, a secret cave with an ancient tunnel access to a spot below David's tomb. Earlier we noted the layers of Mount Zion, with the minaret towering above the holy sites.
Watch your heads.
This cave offers access to a layer dating to antiquity that is even lower than the tombstone.
And it's the closest spot to King David's tomb. Where the roof is that's where, that's the highest spot of the tomb. And then that's also like you have the Muslims there, if you see the thing there. And then on the bottom is the Christians, is the Last Supper room. And they also have like a little thing. And then the lower floor, the floor, is where the Jewish people come, and that's where we see the thing. But now here, it's below all these. And this is like really the actual spot that right by the tomb.
So the lesson we can learn about being close to King David's tomb is, he that is highly exalted shall be brought down to the earth, but that which is brought down to the earth shall be highly exalted.
And below here is another floor. There is another way to get to the passage of 40. There's a 40-meter place where the grave is supposed to be the grave of King David. King David is only a symbol place of where the entrance to the grave is. It's not the grave itself. The grave is further down. And therefore there's a very special...
The grave is located here. They know that for sure.
Yeah. Look, nothing's for sure, but it's handed down tradition through Josephus, through the Arizal, through the Lubavitcher Rebbe, through many, many sources. This is the place.
From Mount Zion, people enter and leave the walled city through the Zion Gate. In Arabic, it's called the Prophet David's Gate because of David's tomb. The area around Mount Zion has a number of cemeteries.
Oskar Schindler, an industrialist, was a member of the Nazi Party, but became a righteous Gentile and saved hundreds of Jews. He is buried here on Mount Zion.